So I was saying that I have as much to learn on this topic as I have to share on this topic. So I'm hoping that what we have is an interactive panel, an interactive session, because I want to hear from those actually involved in business rather than just approaching it from my theoretical perspective as an international trade lawyer. Now, I want to start, I'm a storyteller as well as being an international trade lawyer. This is my Bible as a lawyer, this international law documents. So this is going to be the focus of my conclusion when we talk about what can be done. What can be done about the sanctions? I believe there are things that can be done that haven't been done. But before I get into that, I want to tell you a story, right? And this is a story that happened in 2015. This is when I used my own version of quiet diplomacy to personally fight sanctions. And in that way, I won a small but important victory for Zimbabwe. So in 2015, my favorite newspaper, called the Financial Times, and one that I have written for on a number of occasions, launched a new prize for artists. This was called the Financial Times Oppenheimer Fund Emerging Voices Award. It had a huge purse, $40,000 for the winner in 3 categories: in film, in literature, and in visual art. Now, what was so interesting was who the prize was open to. It said it was open to all artists from Latin America, from Asia, and from Africa. In other words, it was open to all artists from the developing world. But then when you looked closer, as I did, you saw that there was a list of eligible countries for each continent. So of course, being African, I went to Africa. And what do I find? That the last country beginning with the letter Z was the land of my birth, Zambia. It was not the land that raised me, Zimbabwe. So where was Zimbabwe? Surely a prize open to all of Africa should include Zimbabwe. So I wrote to the Financial Times. I believe there's been an oversight. Zimbabwe is not on the list. I got back a nice email from the prize administrator. It was no oversight, she said. And this is what she wrote, and I quote her email as I read it. Due to sanctions against Zimbabwe, it would not be possible to pay the winner if the winner was Zimbabwean. I was really crushed by this because already our athletes and our other artists are shut out from the Commonwealth Games and other prizes, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and so on. So I pushed back and very gently I said, why is this? After all, the sanctions are only targeted at certain individuals. She wrote back and she said that their bank, and she named it as HSBC, was not allowed to transact in Zimbabwe. I pushed back some more. I'm Zimbabwean. I used to write for the FT when I lived in Zimbabwe. And you paid my money to my account in Geneva. Surely you can think of creative mechanisms to get around this absurdity. Perhaps the winner could be paid through a relative's account or something. It does not have to go directly to Zimbabwe. And then I added, it's a pity to shut out Zimbabwean artists when they were, in fact, among the people least cushioned by government's punitive measures and by the tanking economy. This prize would be a godsend to our artists, I said. Just imagine the visibility it would give. I didn't get a reply. Then 3 weeks later, I got a very nice message. They had reconsidered and found a loophole and a mechanism by which they could pay the winners if they were from Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe was now included. Now, this is not just a theoretical thing, because 1 year later, in 2016, a Zimbabwean artist won the visual art portion of the competition. His name is Gareth Nyandoro, an artist whose work I have personally collected. I was excited, and this prize helped him to blow up. The next year, he was included in Zimbabwe's second Biennale at Venice. And his paintings are now worth an average of, I can no longer afford them. Perhaps the whole group can afford them. They're worth an average of $100,000 per painting. And that prize helped him to get to where he was. Of course, the talent was there, but that prize helped him to gain that visibility. So when he won, I felt like I had won. I felt like the whole nation had won. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you this story because this is the thing that the sanctions debate is missing. It's missing the human element. It's missing the people at the core of the debate who are suffering from these sanctions. Because the sanctions, even in their updated version by the United States last week, are not just targeted sanctions. They are what in international law we call chilling measures, right? They are chilling measures that go beyond targeted sanctions. They go beyond ZEDERA. They go beyond OFAC lists. They affect the whole country. And they have been taken for one reason and one reason only, for regime change purposes. They have been taken to isolate Zimbabwe internationally. Kuti Zimbabwe imboyuwira kushika government yachinja. That's the purpose of these sanctions. You can call them, if you're in business, you can call them inconveniences, you can call them blockages, you can call them sanctions, whatever you call them, they have the same chilling effect of isolating Zimbabwe. And Zimbabweans, we all suffer. I believe, and I've always believed, I was known as an opponent to government during the Mugabe era, right? I wrote a lot. I wrote many articles. I wrote, very passionate pieces opposing human rights violations in Zimbabwe. I still oppose them. I oppose the use of police brutality. I oppose the use of force by the armed security services, but I also oppose sanctions. I also oppose sanctions because sanctions are wrong. And I'll tell you why they are wrong. The government likes to use the term illegal sanctions. That's the wrong term. One of the things I'm hoping I succeeded in doing when I worked at OPC was to persuade the move away from the term illegal to the term unilateral. Because the sanctions are not illegal. They are legal under the laws of the United States. They are legal under the laws of the European Union. They are legal under Swiss law. They are legal under Australian law. Legality or illegality is not the issue here, ladies and gentlemen. It's the unilateral nature of these sanctions. When you have what the United Nations calls a security threat in international law, you are allowed to take multilateral action through the United Nations. So supposing there's war, then there is war in Gaza, right? There's war in Ukraine. So if Israel, for instance, feels that there is a threat to international security, it cannot go in on its own. It has to go unilaterally, right? That's the basis of international law of aggression. You cannot take unilateral action to go to war without the approval of the Security Council. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a war. War has been declared on Zimbabwe by the United States through these sanctions. But what action have they taken multilaterally? You may recall that in 2008, after that horrible period of violence, they tried to bring Zimbabwe to the Security Council, and that failed. That failed. That failed because under international law, there is no threat to security of the international order that exists in Zimbabwe. So these countries are not able to take multilateral action under the United Nations. Flash back a little bit to Rhodesia. The situation in Rhodesia, the liberation struggle, was considered a threat, a destabilizing threat, not just for Rhodesia as it then was, but for the whole region. And so action was taken in the United Nations. Sanctions were brought against Rhodesia. Multilateral sanctions were brought against Rhodesia. What we have in Zimbabwe, what the United States recently confirmed, are unilateral sanctions, sanctions that a country takes on its own without consulting the wider international family. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the reasons I believe that sanctions are wrong. at least these particular sanctions are wrong because they're not taken multilaterally, they are being taken unilaterally as an extension of foreign policy, as an extension of certain desires to achieve particular results. And that particular results is regime change. I do not believe that under international law, it is right to take unilateral action to force regime change. So that's the first point, that these sanctions are wrong because they are unilateral, right? And they are a form of unilateral global policing when we have an entire setup through the United Nations that does this global policing on behalf of the whole world, only in those situations that threaten international peace and security. And I want to say that nothing in Zimbabwe, right, that has been used to justify these sanctions comes anywhere near close to threatening international peace and security. Even if you say, as they have said, that the government is corrupt, that is not a threat to international peace and security. I'm sorry. Corruption is a domestic issue that should be addressed domestically through strengthening the right institutions to address it. Corruption cannot be addressed by Washington, D.C., taking sanctions against Zimbabwe. Now, again, this is not to say that I support corruption, of course I don't, or that I support human rights violations, of course I don't. But there are instruments that have been developed and that can be developed to address these without going to sanctions. Another reason that sanctions are wrong is that they are a blunt instrument. As I've illustrated through the story of this Oppenheimer Financial Times Award, they affect the ordinary person. I have a story here. When I talked about this on my social media a couple of years ago, a person called Sam Sif wrote the following: I am working with the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development and Gigawatt in setting up solar farms in Central and Southern Africa. This is a potential revenue source for faith communities, especially the rural poor. You can imagine my heartbreak when I was told that my home country, Zimbabwe, would not be considered because Gigawatt was not allowed to invest in Zimbabwe due to Sidera. Yet another example that showed the blunt nature of this instrument that we call sanctions. Sanctions, ladies and gentlemen, are a blunt instrument that hurt the weak and the vulnerable and the poor. Sanctions are said to be targeted at the political elites, but it's not the political elites that suffer, because guess what? The political elites can evade sanctions. The political elite can do all sorts of things to open other bank accounts in other countries and so on, but it is the poor that end up suffering. And then there's another reason that I think the United States was short-sighted in its revision of the sanctions last week. And this is that sanctions against Zimbabwe have not worked. And they have not worked even for the purposes for which they were intended, right? Sidera talks about revising the land policy. Has it been revised? No, it has not. And the larger regime change agenda. Well, guess what? There was a form of regime change in Zimbabwe in 2017, but it was not because of sanctions. It was because of internal conflict within ZANU-PF and the army stepping in. That's what created regime change. In 2017, it was not sanctions. So for the purposes for which sanctions are intended, which is regime change in Zimbabwe, sanctions have failed. And sanctions will continue to fail because it is not sanctions that is going to get the opposition into State House. And in fact, interestingly, if you look at the GNU, Morgan Tsvangirai, may his soul rest in peace, and Arthur Mutambara, and David Coulthard went around the world saying sanctions against Zimbabwe must be lifted. They campaigned for sanctions to be lifted because once in government, they understood the tight grip that sanctions were having on even basic government programs. They tried to get sanctions lifted while they were in government. And were they lifted? No, they were not, right? Nelson Mandela, how long did it take for Nelson Mandela to be not be designated as a terrorist? He was only removed from the terrorist list of the United States, I think it was in 2008, right? So sanctions have this horrible lingering effect where even if there's some kind of regime change and people now say sanctions should be lifted, it's very, very hard to lift sanctions once they have been imposed on a country. Look at Cuba, right? Look at Cuba. There's been a form of regime change in Cuba, right? Fidel Castro is no more and so on and so on. But the sanctions on Cuba still remain. So I want to leave you with this thought, right? Because I really want us to have an interactive discussion. Sorry, before I go to that thought, the other thing that makes sanctions wrong is that they are completely inconsistent with multilateral efforts to re-engage Zimbabwe. The IMF had recently had a staff-monitored program. The World Bank is engaged in Zimbabwe. So why have unilateral sanctions when the multilateral agencies in which countries like the United States are members, countries like the United Kingdom and the various countries of the EU, they are members in these multilateral agencies that are trying to re-engage Zimbabwe. So it seems to me that sanctions are in effect a very, sorry to use a psychiatric term, but a schizophrenic response to the Zimbabwe situation. On the one hand, you want to engage through the multilateral agencies, but on the other hand, you are imposing sanctions unilaterally. So I think that sanctions should be removed because they are unilateral, and for that reason, they are wrong. They do not achieve regime change. They hurt the ordinary person, and they are completely inconsistent with multilateral efforts to engage. Now, I want to take you back to Rhodesia. That was the point I was going to come to. I want you to take you back to Rhodesia because there's this myth, and you guys in industry are familiar with it. There's this myth that sanctions against Rhodesia succeeded, right? Sanctions against Rhodesia led to import substitution. That part is true. Sanctions led to import substitution because Rhodesia suffered. And it wasn't the elites of Rhodesia that suffered. It was ordinary people, both black and white. I have this wonderful statement from a friend of mine who said, most people are too young to remember how broke Rhodesia was. The travel allowance was about $300 a year. Sanctions and a lack of foreign currency meant the shelves were empty of anything that wasn't made in the country. The war hoovered up every last cent of forex in the economy. Fuel was rationed and smuggling was rife. The bureaucracy needed to maintain an essentially illegal, in terms of trade, economy was vast and expensive. There were waiting lists for cars, and these were limited to basic Peugeots, Renaults, Alfa Suds, which is a bastardized kind of BMW that sent the Germans into a frenzy. And perhaps most significantly of all, this false economy created a business culture based on externalizing money and cheating the taxman, a culture that prevails to this day. So this is a person who grew up in Rhodesia and remembers vividly what Rhodesia was like. And he's making the point that due to sanctions, which, by the way, were properly instituted multilateral sanctions, the ordinary person still suffered. The ordinary person still suffered because Rhodesia became extremely expensive while the government essentially was broke. Now, on my last thought, what can be done to address sanctions, whether the recent United States sanctions, EU sanctions, or any other sanctions? The opposition, perhaps human rights activists, rightly say that things need to change in the country, right? And they believe that sanctions are meant to force a behavioral change. But I don't believe that at all. again, I will ask, until when was Nelson Mandela designated a terrorist? Why didn't the US and others lift sanctions during the GNU? So I am not sure that sanctions will eventually be lifted if the regime changes. Because I am actually now convinced that sanctions are a form of coercion, because Zimbabwe can be bullied. We're a small developing country and we can be bullied. I don't know that if there's regime change in the way that the United States wants it, I don't know that the sanctions will be lifted, right? And of course, we all want change. We want better lives for our children. We want our children to go to good schools. We want to have, enough for our families to eat, and we want jobs for our young people. But I think it is dangerous, even with wanting all those things, I think it is dangerous to give so much power to a handful of the most, of the strongest countries, to give them the power to take punitive action to essentially force regime change. And there's something funny that used to happen during the Mugabe regime, how the different countries would coordinate their sanctions, right? So they would do them all around the same time. And then they would issue a joint statement. United States, the EU, Switzerland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. And this was supposed to give the veneer of multilateralism to what were essentially unilateral actions, essentially foreign policy actions. They even used to have what they called the fishmongers group, which would meet for lunch every month, I think, at the fishmongers restaurant in Avondale. And it was the fishmongers group that coordinated all these sanctions. And then they would, give a joint statement to make it seem as though there was multilateral action being taken against Zimbabwe, when really it was just a bunch of guys sitting in Avondale having lunch. Finally, I want to leave you with this thought before we open up the floor to discussion. I want you to leave you with this thought that I don't think the government of Zimbabwe has done nearly enough to address sanctions. And I don't mean the regime change aspect of it. I mean, they haven't done enough in terms of challenging the sanctions. I don't believe you can have sanctions challenged or removed by paying expensive lobbyists, right? That's money down the drain. That's not going to change anything. I think what could potentially change things is if the government actually did what the South Africans have done with Israel and went to court, right? And there are various venues that you can challenge these sanctions in. One is you can actually challenge these sanctions in the United States itself, right? In the US courts, right? Some of the individuals who've been placed on those sanctions could try and challenge them in the courts. But I think the best challenge would be an international challenge. And I would love to discuss this with the relevant people in government, because I've actually found a mechanism by which you can actually challenge sanctions under the WTO in terms of how they affect trade. I'm sure that I'm going to hear a lot from you on this, but it's true that there's no trade embargo. The sanctions do not stop you from trading with other countries. You can send your products across, around the world, but they do have what is called a chilling effect on how you transact that trade. The number of hoops you have to go through to get your products into the EU, right? To get your products into the US, right? It is that aspect that I believe you can challenge under the WTO through something that's called a non-violation complaint. And this is when you say to a country, look, you are obeying the letter of the law of the WTO. You haven't imposed excessive tariffs on me. You haven't imposed visible non-tariff barriers, but the kind of actions you are taking in imposing sanctions, even on these individuals, is having a chilling effect on my trade. It's having a chilling effect on my ability to trade and to send my products across the world. So I believe that there's a very good potential case here, but of course, the government has to be willing to take it. On that note, I'm going to stop talking and maybe take some questions and maybe hear your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those insightful deliberations, Dr. Gappah. For the audience benefits, Dr. Gappah mentions that sanctions are not only affecting the targeted individuals or entities, but they are actually affecting the ordinary citizens. So she also says that the sanctions debate is missing the human element as the measures go beyond this data or the updated vision of the sanctions on Zimbabwe. Um, she mentions that sanctions are actually wrong and they are blunt in nature. So there is need for us to move away from calling them illegal, but to say they are unilateral coercive measures that have been taken by the United States on Zimbabwe. And they, in terms of their effectiveness, you mentioned that they've not actually worked in achieving the purposes in which they were put in place in the year 2000 and the various versions of those sanctions. And in terms of outlook or predictions, says that sanctions are more likely to remain in place for the foreseeable future. She gave the Cuban case, the Cuban example as a case in point. However, she strongly advocates for their unconditional removal, and she wants to hear from you, our delegates, that how best can we address these sanctions, and she proposes challenging them through the WTO laws as they have a chilling effect on international trade. So at this moment, we open the floor. You can show by raising your hand, your virtual hand, then we can take a round of questions or contributions. Are you all satisfied with the discussion we're having?
Perhaps I could ask a question that could get people talking. Is anybody here who has been directly affected by sanctions? Anybody?
Well, for me, I know of certain companies. One is an SME that that exports artifacts to the UK, the EU. So when they want payments, they have to use international financial platforms like PayPal. So as you mentioned in your case, so if you are in Zimbabwe, you cannot have your money deposited into your PayPal account if you are from Zimbabwe. And then there was another company that was into international trade as well. Some of their funds were actually frozen under the OFAC arrangements.
Yeah.
And that company was not even part of the entities that were targeted.
Okay, so here's my question to you. You've given these two excellent examples, right? The PayPal example, and then this company whose funds were frozen. But these are not persons who are on the targeted list.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that they were caught in the crossfire, even though they themselves are actually not on the targeted sanctions?
I think it has to do with even those data measures, and OFAC does try to implement the restrictive measures that are there. So by the virtue that those companies are operating in Zimbabwe, they are under the negative effects of those sanctions on international trade.
Precisely. And the PayPal situation is a very interesting one. Because even if they're just like, as in the case now, they're just 13 persons on the targeted sanctions. The banks and other, payment platforms have to implement what are called, I think the acronym is KYNC or something like that. Know your customer or know your client, right? And because they can't filter out the possibility that somebody on the sanctions list is using Jeffias Makiwa's name to transact, right? Do you understand? They can't be sure that Letwin Mawire or Andrew Chireo or Petina Gappah are not being used by person XYZ on the sanctions list. So they just block out the whole country. Can you imagine? They just
That's
block
great.
out the whole country. Yeah.
We have a comment in the chat box. It say, any comment on the US representatives call for investors and businesses to explore opportunities in Zimbabwe following the new measures? How the Zimbabwe Sanctions Program and Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act?
Yeah, thank you, Johanna. This is from Johanna Virima, right? I would also like to hear some thoughts on this, because to me, this seems to be wildly inconsistent, right? On the one hand, you're saying the US should invest and businesses should explore opportunities in Zimbabwe, right? But at the same time, you're restricting how they should do it. I have to look a little bit more into what it means, because unfortunately, I only got this invitation rather late, but I would like to look a little bit more into how this plays, the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, whether there really is a difference, right, in between that and ZIDERA or OFAC and so on. But I think my gut instinct is that sanctions are sanctions. But what I would like to do for you guys, there's a paper that I'm hoping to share with some of the powers that be, and I want it to go to business. I want it to go to government as well. So once I've had a couple of weeks to really research into this, I want to actually do something that I've been meaning to do for the longest time, because I talk a lot about sanctions. I write on social media about sanctions, but I haven't actually, apart from a few newspaper articles on diamonds and here and there, I haven't actually really dug into it and done a white paper on sanctions. So that's effectively what I want to do. So Johanne, once I've done that paper, I'm going to ask my friends at ZNCC to circulate it widely.
Yes, that will be very much appreciated. And
Yeah.
there's also another comment from Kudzai Mchena.
Yeah.
Thank you for the insightful presentation. Sanctions or restrictive measures or chilling instruments are complex and multifaceted and require a complex and multifaceted response. In addition to the proposed legal challenges in the need an audit.
Yeah.
What restrictive measures are still in place, how they are affecting businesses, and how we can collectively address them.
Precisely. That's exactly, and this is exactly why for me, this wonderful meeting is just an opportunity to start this work, right? Because I think that there's been a lot of talk. And this for me is the disappointment that I have with government, that they're using sanctions as propaganda, right? Anti-sanctions day, you don't remove sanctions by marching in Robert Mugabe Square. You don't remove sanctions by calling on all the African nations who are your allies to say sanctions must be removed. You have to take real action. But before you take that real action, Kudzai, you are absolutely right. There hasn't been enough. I mean, we hear all this anecdotal evidence. There hasn't been enough to actually document, right, the effects of the sanctions on business. I would actually like to come up with a quantitative figure, right? This is how much the Zimbabwean economy is losing every year to sanctions. Similarly, I think we should also do, this is how much, the Zimbabwean economy is losing every year to corruption. But I find that in Zimbabwe, maybe because we tend to be very afraid of figures, but I think we need to actually have a forensic study, right? That helps us understand what the actual implication and how actually sanctions affect business. So thank you very much for that, Kudzai. And by the way, if this WTO challenge, comes, Zimbabwe has been only in 3 disputes, right, in the WTO and as third parties. The first one was the asbestos case, where Canada imposed certain measures on exports of asbestos, right? And the second was the shrimp turtle case, where Zimbabwe was a third party. And the other one, I think, was the cotton case involving cotton subsidies that the United States had was giving to its farmers to the detriment of farmers in the international or in Africa especially. And all of these cases were driven by industry, right? So when in the WTO, for instance, one of the cases I worked on, one of my favorite cases was the aircraft case between Canada and Brazil and the European Union. Now, the reality, it was all about aircraft subsidies for the manufacturing of aircraft. Now, it wasn't Canada and Brazil and the EU behind these cases. It was Boeing, it was Embraer, it was Airbus, the manufacturers of the planes, right? So if the WTO option is to be made real, industry has to get behind it. Industry has to get behind the case that Zimbabwe will bring to the WTO. Similarly, I represented the government of Thailand in a sugar dispute against the EU, again involving sugar subsidies. And there we worked very closely with the Thai sugar sector, right? You cannot have a WTO challenge that does not involve business. So I would say that Kudzai's point is probably the most important takeaway that I'm taking from this discussion, which is that, as she says, we need an audit as to what restrictive measures are still in place, how they are affecting business, and how we can collectively address them. Thank you. Andrew says, what is the role of diplomacy in all of this? What are your views with regards to this? Look, I think that one mistake, and I really miss Minister S.B. Moyo. Minister S.B. Moyo was a big believer in diplomacy. What happened during the Mugabe regime, and I'm not saying anything that I'm not allowed to speak in ways that breach confidence, even after I left government, right? That's just the nature of the job, right? But one thing I can say, which was pretty obvious to everybody, was that during the Mugabe regime, foreign affairs was being run from the president's office, right? It was being run as an extension of intelligence, right? Which means that there was an over-reliance on propaganda, right? There was an over-reliance on this really megaphone, it's not even megaphone diplomacy, like so megaphone tactics. Yekuti ambassador anotukwa muherald, kutukwa kubva kumusoro kusvika kuzasi kwebhutsi kwake, where you have these really angry statements about foreign policy being driven from the president's office, from OPC. Whereas I think that after the change in 2017, the minister, S.B. Moyo, took a much more nuanced viewpoint, and he was a real believer in diplomacy and using diplomacy to try and unlock some of this. And it seems to have some effect. He was considered a very charming person, very likable. And it's always good to talk to somebody that you can have a drink with and so on. I mean, that's the nature of diplomacy, right? So I think since he left, there seems to be a little bit more reliance again on the sort of like the propaganda aspect to the sanctions. And by the way, that is perhaps one of the most important reasons why we should drop sanctions, because sanctions end up being used as an excuse for failure. Sanctions end up being used as an excuse for failure, right? But I believe that the sanctions debate can be addressed not only through these legal challenges that I've laid out, but also through diplomacy. But it's not the kind of megaphone diplomacy that, trumpeting from the Herald. There was a very strong statement from the government that I read. And I think it struck the right note. It read like it was written by diplomats. It struck the right note, very strong. taking offense to the unilateral, not illegal, to the unilateral nature of the sanctions, and saying essentially that there was no change. But there was also something very powerful that was said in that statement, and that was repeated on Twitter a couple of years ago by Ibo Mandaza. If you're imposing sanctions because you're saying person X, person Y, and person Z are corrupt, show us the evidence. Show us the evidence, because such corruption can only be dealt with in one place, and that's Zimbabwe, right? Corruption is a criminal offense, right? If there is corruption, show us the evidence so that we can deal with it. You can't just say we're imposing sanctions because these 13 individuals or whatever are corrupt and leave it there. So Ibo was very right to say, if there is corruption, and the Americans have proof of the corruption, which is the basis for their decision, show it to the Zimbabweans, because Zimbabweans have a right to know. And that, by the way, is one of the challenges that you could actually bring in US domestic courts, to say you are judging me and imposing a punitive measure on me without showing me what I've been accused of. That is a fundamental right that the US gives to all persons who are punished, right? Because effectively, you've been punished, tried, and sentenced without seeing what evidence is. Again, I'm not saying that there isn't corruption in Zimbabwe. Of course there is, we know there is. But I am saying, if you are going to base a measure on the fact that somebody is corrupt, at least follow due process and show them what that corruption is. There's Stingy, sorry, I can't, Stingy Jisiwe Msiza, Stingy Jisiwe, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you so much for the kind compliment. She says, this is a good presentation. The elite will never feel the painful impact of sanctions, but the general public will. And I think if that's the one takeaway that you get from this, I'll be very, very happy, because elites can always evade sanctions. And elites can always, like, there's this idea that so we'll prevent them from coming to England, we'll put visa restrictions, you can't come to New York. They still go to New York for the United Nations. You can't prevent them from going. They still go to London for different government opportunities. And if people want to shop, they go to Dubai. The same things you find in London, in New York, you can find in Dubai. So this idea that targeted sanctions, travel restrictions are going to hurt the political elites is just simply wrong. It's not true, because the political elites, because they are elites, will always find ways around travel restrictions and around targeted sanctions. That's how they are powerful, right? Just trying to see if there are any more messages. Anybody want to speak? I would love to hear voices other than mine, please. There's somebody I saw with a fantastic name, Jamala Majaya. Jamala Majaha. Is he in? Jama? Jafet Moyo, do you want to say something? Tatenda Katai? This is supposed to be interactive.
Hi, sorry.
Marilyn, you can speak after Tatenda.
Okay.
Tatenda, you can come through. Lloyd, would you want to speak? So,
if there's no one speaking, there's a very excellent, Marianne Marongwe, why don't you please read out your comment? Because this is really important. Marianne, please read out your comment, because I have something to say on that. Marianne Marongwe. Is she in the space?
yeah,
Hi,
let me.
sorry, yeah. All right, let me read it.
Mhm.
So yeah, so even if there's corruption in Zim, is it the only country where corruption exists? Why does the USA not impose sanctions on every country where corruption exists? And as an example, we all watch SA TV. President Ramaphosa was caught with $1 bazillion of US dollars. I'm not saying he's corrupt, but it doesn't look good. And there's always stories on SATV about corruption, tenders, people in high places, but we don't see them imposing any sanctions. If you go to Zambia, you speak to people on the streets, and there's always stories about corruption. You know, people say, you see that more, the president owns it. He gave some tender to so and so. I think my point, I mean, even what's this country in West Africa, Guinea, something where there's a lot of oil, and the president's son, you know, is always having his properties seized all over the world, Equatorial Guinea, but they're not imposing any sanctions on Equatorial Guinea. So I think for me, what I haven't liked about the sanctions is how they paint our leaders as some kind of devils. And I'm not saying that they are angels, but I think if we were to line them up with, you know, all the 54 countries in Africa as far as corruption is concerned, I kind of have a feeling that we won't even be in the top 10, but they've been painted like that. And I think it's rather unfortunate that we have, as Zimbabweans, we have also believed it, that, you know, these people are so terrible. And when the opposition comes in, you know, there will be angels. You know, there's a section of society that thinks like that, which I think is rather naive. So I think, that's my take on it, that, you know, why doesn't the US, you know, go around with their whip and, impose the sanctions on South Africa, on Zambia, on Equatorial Guinea, in Nigeria, where the central bank governor is said to have stolen $6 million, and, you know, their ministers are always running off to London with oil money. There's so much more happening. So why are they so fixated on what happens here? Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That is an excellent contribution. And it allows me to say something that I should have said before, right? Which is that international law, international relations don't work on principle. They really don't. They work on self-interest, and they work on what is it that I can gain from this particular situation, right? Because if international relations worked on principle, you are very right to say that every single country, not just the developed countries, every single country could impose sanctions where they feel that there's corruption. In the United Kingdom, during COVID, it was one of the most corrupt episodes in their country's history, right? There were extreme levels of corruption in the award of tenders for PPE, that is personal protective equipment used in the hospitals. There's even a member of the House of Lords, Baroness Moon, who is facing a corruption inquiry for tenders involving millions and millions of pounds, right? Corruption, Marianne, you're right. Corruption is everywhere. But if we were all to start imposing sanctions on the basis that so-and-so in this particular country is corrupt, then I don't think the world would function, right? Because corruption, as you rightly say, is everywhere. But the reason that they're able to do this for Zimbabwe is, as one US ambassador who's now left the country told me, Zimbabwe is a country that allows the West to stand on principle. In other words, we can be bullied. We don't have oil, at least not yet, right? So we're not Nigeria. How much corruption is there in Nigeria? But Nigeria has oil, right? How much corruption is there in Mozambique? But Mozambique is important because they have a coast, right? They've been helping to fight piracy. They've been helping to fight terrorism, right? How much corruption is there in Kenya? But Kenya is important geopolitically because they are the frontier to Al-Shabaab, right? How much corruption is in Ghana? Ghana has a sea coast, and like Nigeria, some of the most populous African populations, so they are huge markets for Western products. You go to a supermarket in Ghana, and your milk is from Lebanon. Your milk is from the United States. Your milk is from Holland, right? So it's a huge market. So my point really is that because we don't have anything geopolitically that can make us unbullyable, except there's one thing that we do have, which is our minerals, right? Especially our lithium. You know, the minerals that you need for your mobile phones and so on and so on. They are in DRC. How corrupt is the DRC? I could go on and on and on. But my point really is that there's also another element to why Zimbabwe is bullyable. And that's because a significant number of our people are willing to go along with the US agenda. And that's a shame. That's a shame because I think Mark Twain said it best when he said, you should love your country all the time and your government only when they deserve it, right? I think it would be important for the human rights activists and people in opposition to understand that Zimbabwe, as a member of the Committee of Nations, must matter to all of us, even as we disagree with the government. I think there's a way we can actually work for change in our countries, push for respect for human rights, push for respect and abiding by the rule of law, while opposing the kind of unilateral actions that are taken by the United States and that, as Marian says, are not taken against anyone else, even where the same conditions prevail. There's a hand up from Vimbai Nikadzino. Am I correct?
Yes, you are, Doc. Hi, and thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that these sanctions seemingly indirectly affect business, but have a really direct hit on the business environment. I work for a services company in the technologies industry, and sometimes you have vendors that are also providing services to American entities. You can have your enterprise customers who also provide services to American affiliated entities. It can be the US Embassy, or, you know, just as an example. So what you find, you spoke about KYC requirements for the financial services industry, the banks. Yeah. You also find that for service providers other than banks, there's now this requirement for you to check yourself literally on your compliance, check your customers, know your customers and check their compliance from a corruption and sanctions perspective. So you find a whole lot of vendors have started pulling out of Zimbabwe in the technology space. The ripple effect of that is you have to replace those systems with systems from elsewhere, with huge outlays of you know, like investment now that really isn't necessary, you know, because you're literally caught up in a war that's not yours, but it's real. Yeah. And then you're precluded from offering services from certain to certain individuals, and there are these regular checks that are coming. Do you offer services to these ones on the list, and anything affiliated to these ones on the list? So it then becomes, you know, almost a catch-22. You make these disclosures or not. You stop dealing with anyone affiliated with these American companies or not. But either way, it's having a negative impact on how we conduct our day-to-day trade. So I really like your presentation today, and everything you've said is really thought-provoking, and I would be fully in support of industry coming together and working on some challenge on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vimbai. Thank you so much for that. And this is exactly what I think it was Kudzai was saying we need to do, which is that we need an audit. We need an audit of the manner in which business has been affected, the better to prepare a challenge. And I really, really believe a challenge can succeed. I've been looking at it, and I believe a challenge can succeed, but we just need all the sort of like evidence to come together. Sorry, I've just changed my view.
A message from Lloyd Mobeshora. He says, thank you for some very insightful submissions from Dr. Gappah. I would need to hear more, to hear some reflections from the House on the implications of these sanctions to the general consumer or person on the street.
Yeah.
I have somewhat picked up the implications on business. What could be the ways in which the laymen on the street come into participate in the fight against sanctions, or maybe coping mechanism in such an environment? My connectivity is bad. Maybe some of the issues might have been discussed. Essentially, I think this branch is felt at the grassroots more than at the higher levels. And then Kudzaim Chena says maybe this is the right forum, but what was the input of the press conference by the US Embassy on the 6th of March on the new restrictive measures? I haven't seen any new news articles or reports on it.
Yeah, so let me just address the press conference. I haven't seen anything on that either. So I don't know if anybody else in the group has seen something, maybe they can share with us. But I really like what Lloyd Mombeshora said, right? Because we're talking about business. What about the consumer? How is the consumer suffering from the imposition of sanctions? I can actually think of one way in which the consumer might suffer. If you have to evade payment platforms, right? And basically, you know how terrorists get money across borders to fund my suicide bomb attacks and so on. They use things like jewelry, right? You smuggle jewelry across the Noe black market. So you are relying on a black market to fund your illegal activities. And in essence, this is what Zimbabwe has become. My friend Brian Latham, who gave me that comment about Rhodesia, said, and let me just go back to that, Lloyd, in case you missed it. He said, most significantly of all, this false economy created a business culture, and I would add a consumer culture based on externalizing money, cheating the taxman, that prevails to this day. Now, if you're externalizing money, if you're cheating the taxman, who really suffers? It's your consumers, isn't it, right? So the knock-on effect on all of this is that there's no transparency on anything, right? So there's no transparency even on prices. There are these famous examples that people give of salad cream and what is it? Imported butter, Danish butter, and other things, Nivea, Vanani, that are coming in at shocking prices. Your whiskeys, your blue labels. Of course, one could say that they are luxury items. Yes, let's admit that they are luxury items. But still, they say something to us about the economy. How many of those products do you think came through borders? You know, how many people here, you don't have to indicate your hand, I don't want to give you away, but how many people here know somebody who has a runner in South Africa? A runner who brings in things under the radar, right? And when you do things under the radar, it is the consumer who ends up suffering, right? Because you have to pay through the nose to bring things in. So obviously you want to make your profit. And I would love for us to, again, in our survey, in our audit, and I'm really, really convinced that this is necessary, to look as well at what the effect is on the consumer.
All right, thank you very much. I don't know if there's anyone else with a burning issue or question or contribution. I think there's nobody else with a contribution or question. So by this, I just want to express.
Sorry, Jeff, I have a burning question. Do you guys cooperate with the CZI? With the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industry? Do you cooperate with them?
Yes, I think my CEO, Chris Mugaga, is also in. Chief, are you able to chip in?
Thank you very much, Jeff. You put me on the spotlight. Thank you, Petina.
Hi, Chris.
How are you? Thank you
Good
very
to
much.
see you.
It's a pleasure. I was following and had a very rich presentation. In terms of our interaction with private sector, CZI, Chamber of Mines, Bankers Association of Zimbabwe, we work together. Maybe you might be aware that we have got the TNF, and under TNF, one of the arms, which is the employers, we are coming together. Possibly, I'm not sure if a piece of legislation will be put in place to allow for us to work together and have one voice on all these issues.
Yeah.
But we can safely say we do work together. We have a very strong relationship.
Okay. Okay, so that allows me to then make a proposal. You know, I don't do these things. I don't do SAPES if I can help it. I don't like these Zoom discussions that lead nowhere. Chris, you know me. In interim action, I always used to say to HE, I'll never bring you a problem without a solution. And I have brought you a problem. We are discussing a problem, but there is a solution. So is it possible after, because I'm traveling in March, but in the next 2 weeks to sit down, Chris, right? And then maybe convene a meeting, maybe through the TNF or with some of these actors, so that we petition government to say, listen, there's something you can do, right? And there's something you can do and something should be done. If only, you know, there's a wonderful statement, there's a wonderful story about a hare, Katsuro, right? That met a leopard. And the leopard said, I'm going to eat you now. And the hare said, no, but before you do that, I just need to do a few things. So the tsuro, the little hare, started running around a tree, leaves, you know, touching leaves and digging up soil, and then said, okay, I'm ready to be eaten. And the leopard said, why did you do that? And then the tsuro said, well, so that when they find my bones, they'll believe that at least I tried to fight, right? So let's try to fight, right? We may not succeed, but let's try to fight, and let's go beyond the solidarity statements that are coming from the African Union, which are important, by the way, because they are part of our case to say that there's an international consensus against this. But I would say that the statements in themselves are not enough. We need to actually take an action. Thank you.
Very important. No, thank you, Petty. We certainly take note of that. Very important issues you have raised. Once again, but thank you very much. I was following and I couldn't stop marveling at your presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Jeff. I think as you conclude your meeting.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, I would like to express my gratitude to you, Dr. Gappah, for the time you have afforded us to be part of this webinar. We'll move ahead and we'll keep in touch in the way forward in terms of dealing with this issue. As we have said, that there is need for an audit on how these sanctions have been affecting businesses as well as the consumer. So I also want to thank all the participants in this webinar for taking your time to be with us today. Every Friday, we have these meetings at 9. Please continue to support us. With that, I wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our meeting. I will just leave you with an advert for your information. Thank you.
Thank you, Petina. Thank you, Mr. Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.
Bye.
We hope to see you in Zim soon. When are you coming?
I am in Zim. I'm in Highlands.
Please, let's get sharp.
Let's have lunch soon. Okay.
That's fine. No, thanks, Betty.
Work with the policymakers, to work with even the financiers of different projects to which we know.